Somewhat recently, I've become extremely interested in the historical period known as the Napoleonic Wars, which for any layman's was the period that Napoleon Bonaparte was trying to rule Europe. Due to this, I began researching the period and the battles quite a lot, and came across the 1970 film Waterloo, which is a historical film of the final battle that would see Napoleon's defeat. Due to this newfound interest in this period, I watched the film despite not being a big fan of historical war films, and was quickly blown away by it, and instantly it became one of my favourite films of all time, and so I've decided I need to talk about it, in at least some capacity. Now, due to it being a historical film, it's more complex than a fictional narrative to discuss, and since I'm still quite a layman to the period myself, I will be focused more on it as a film rather than historical aspects of it, so don't expect a deep dive into the factual errors, as while I have done some research into that, I have found that this film seems to be remarkably accurate, with a few exceptions that I might talk about. But let's get into the film and see what it's like. So despite being called Waterloo, the film begins a year earlier, as the plot spends quite a lot of time setting up the events that led to the battle itself. The film begins with Napoleon's exile in 1814, where after a series of losses, the combined forces of the British, Prussians, Russians and Spanish have beaten his army, and offered him exile to end the war. The scene is focused on setting up the character of Napoleon himself and his relationship both with his marshals and the old guard. We get to see Napoleon's refusal to give up until it's clear it's a lost cause, and he is forced to accept the terms of his enemies. The performance here is great, with a powerful speech that falls on deaf ears due to the overwhelming force they're facing. But his speech to his old guard is even better than that. This speech is a goodbye to the soldiers he can't take with him to the island of Elba for his exile, and while we haven't seen the relationship between him and them before, the way he speaks and the emotion on their faces makes this unseen relationship very clear. The close-ups of the old guard also makes this clear, as they're struggling to hold back their own emotion, demonstrating what he meant to them as a commander. And so in just one scene, the film has excellently demonstrated a dynamic that has been built up over several years of war, while also setting up their place in the Grand Army, which becomes important later. All of these scenes take up only a fraction of the film, but are important for setting the scene, as the importance of a titular battle and several events in the film lose their impact without the context offered here. The next section of the film is the 100 Days, this being the period beginning with Napoleon's escape from Elba and his retaking of France, until his surrender, but the film doesn't cover the last few weeks of this, due to his focus being on the titular Battle of Waterloo. This section of the film is quite short, but is well paced, as the focus is first on Napoleon being faced with an overwhelming French force sent by the new king, Louis XVIII, led by Marshal Ney, and then him rebuilding his army while trying to restore his place as the emperor, with him rapidly having several letters written, one of which to his former wife asking for his son to be sent to him, while the others are to heads of state to prevent any further war, so he can rebuild his power. The encounter with Ney's army is my favourite bit of this section, due to how shocking of an event it is. As a viewer with little context, you expect a battle to occur, and Napoleon obviously to win, but instead, he has his men stand down and walks up to Ney's army, leaving himself completely defenceless. The order is given to fire, but no soldier does so, and soon enough they rally to his side. It's an incredible scene, as just the presence of Napoleon is enough to turn the opposing French army back to his side. The letter writing scene is less interesting, as it's mostly exposition to set up events, notably him suggesting the idea of peace to other nations, which doesn't work out as it ends with Napoleon being declared an enemy of humanity. But the scene acts as a great insight into Napoleon's psyche and how he's dealing with the situation, since he's clearly on the back foot at this point. This takes us to the nearly 40 minutes mark, and this is where we move to the British side of things. Now there are more than just the British involved here, but I say the British as the main character of focus is Napoleon's rival, the Duke of Wellington, plus the characters that support him who are mostly British as well. These scenes first take place at a party between the nations of the coalition, before shifting to the commanders of the army preparing to face Napoleon, this being spurred on by the news that he has attacked the Prussian army, with Napoleon intending to keep the two opposing armies separate from each other. The sudden change to the atmosphere is great, as Wellington tries to keep a straight face during the ball, but soon enough has to leave and begin to take action, planning out where the battle will be fought, that being near the town of Waterloo. From here, we switch between the two perspectives as they prepare for the battle. The French side focuses on Napoleon's health at the time, as his body is beginning to die, while Wellington's focuses on his relationship with his army, notably in the scene in which he confronts a redcoat who is stealing a pig, and for his sheer nerve to try and defend himself gives him a promotion to corporal. This is a notable difference between the focus of the two sides, as we get a stronger focus on the redcoats of the coalition than we do of the troops of the Grand Army, with even the old guard not getting any focus, where they're more individuals rather than an army. The night before the battle is quite calm despite the tenseness of the situation. Both sides are waiting for daybreak so the battle can begin, with Wellington desperate for the Prussian support, while Napoleon is quite confident in his victory due to him seeing the location as a tactical mistake for Wellington. But his mood is lowered by his health, which is holding him back, and will come to hinder him during the battle. The Battle of Waterloo is what most people talk about with this film, as for one it makes up nearly half the film, but also for just the scale and accuracy of it, with this depiction being one of the peaks of the battles put to film. To explain why this is, we have to talk about how the scale was achieved, and this was through the hiring of 15,000 Soviet soldiers as extras, meaning the director had enough men to actually depict the two armies in grand sweeping shots that show the entire battlefield. Beyond that, it means that any time we have action, or even just marching, there is a grand sense of scale to the battle, making this one of the few films from the days before CGI that could make a battle like this look as large scale as it probably was. And even after the creation of CGI, it still looks far more real than many films that can achieve this scale. Just the knowledge that everyone on screen is a real person really adds to the experience of watching it, as you know what you see is actually what it looked like on the day. As for the battle itself, the film covers the entire battle, with a few time skips to get through the several hours that it occurred over, beginning at 11:35 and ending late in the evening. The battle is quite a bloody spectacle, as while there isn't too much gore in the grand scheme, at least until the end, there are several events which are horrific in nature, notably the several cavalry charges, and the general advance of troops into fortified positions. Between all the action, there are calmer moments though, where the commanders are talking and both sides presented quite similarly in this regard, with both Napoleon and Wellington having well-defined dynamics with their fellow commanders, and so both get serious moments of command alongside more humorous moments. I think Wellington gets the more humorous ones, but they fade away as the battle gets going, and turns out of his favour, meaning we shift to a more serious attitude, and there's a sense of desperation added to the performance. The director does an excellent job at giving each engagement within the battle scale, even if it's just the soldiers marching at one another. This combined with the smaller moments of character keeps the battlefield alive, and it doesn't just become two groups shooting at one another. This is where the importance of the redcoats comes into effect, as they give us some characters of focus within the ranks, which gives us a bit more life to the coalition, which is somewhat lacked by the Grand Army. I think the only weakness of this battle is the lack of a sense of death until the end, as outside of a few engagements, there isn't a grand sense of the armies being thinned out by the thousands of fatalities. Ney's cavalry charge does the best job at demonstrating the losses during the battle, but for the most part there isn't a sense of the army shrinking. We do have some engagements that have heavy casualties, but due to the scale of the battle, these moments are quite minor in the grand scheme. The battle ends when the Prussians arrive, and their might combined with the rest of the coalition breaks the old guard, losing Napoleon the battle. It's from here the battle feels its most bloodiest, mostly due to a scene where some French troops reject the offer of surrender, but I will come back to that later as I have more to discuss with it. The arrival of the Prussians is well handled, as throughout the battle they have been built up to. Even before the battle we have the aftermath of their own battle against the Grand Army, leading to their retreat, alongside Wellington sending out for their support the night before. Then during the battle they are mentioned on occasion, with the most notable occurrence being when they're first sighted. This moment is great as it ramps up the tension, with there being a level of uncertainty as to whether it's the Prussians or the third of the Grand Army that Napoleon sent to chase them. Their arrival does have a suddenness to it, which is obviously for dramatic effect, as we do know they are on their way, but due to this occurring at the moment in the film when the potential defeat of a coalition is at its most notable, it makes a sudden arrival more dramatic. The film ultimately ends with Napoleon leaving the battlefield due to the commands of his marshals, and even as he leaves, you can see the sense of failure on his face, while in his marshals you can see a similar expression to what they had at the start of the film, where they were encouraging him to accept exile. Something I have to discuss with this film is a theme that crops up later on in the film, this being about the horrible nature of war. This idea is present in a few scenes, with the most notable being during Ney's cavalry charge, the rejected surrender, and as Wellington goes over the battlefield at the end of the battle. This theme is where some of the historical inaccuracies come from, since as far as I'm aware there was no surrender offered to a group of French, and I think a soldier killed during the scene lived for a time after the battle. But the purpose of this scene is to demonstrate the horror of war, as one side refuses to give in, and so the other is left with no choice but to kill them. This allows the film to get away with minor historical inaccuracies, as it's part of a larger idea. The earlier scene I mentioned during Ney's cavalry charge has a soldier break formation and walking to the battlefield, screaming at the top of his lungs why they are fighting. This occurring during one of the bloodiest moments in the film, as the French cavalry are slaughtered by the British squares. This soldier has only appeared in a few scenes up to this point, and in them has only been hesitant about the idea of fighting, with this moment being when his training breaks and as a result of his plea, dies. The scene with Wellington takes place soon after the surrender scene, as that moment essentially ends the battle. There is only a single line from Wellington, in which he hopes that this is the last battle he sees. This happening when he's walking over the field coated in the corpse of both the British and French soldiers. This is really the only time we get a sense of the amount of death that occurred during the battle, and that's only from a small area from the end of the battle, where the fighting had become more desperate. The film is clearly against war, and the seemingly needless waste of life. Thousands slaughtering thousands for the desires of only a few people who don't like someone else. It focuses on the horrific nature of it, and it works within the context of the film, due to Napoleon's goals of conquest, and so it isn't people fighting to survive or for something they stand for, instead for someone's ideals, something too many wars have been fought for. Now let's talk about the movie's two leads in a bit more detail, and we'll begin with the most prominent, Napoleon, played by Rod Steiger. I have heard this is a great depiction of Napoleon, and even without knowing him all that well, the way he is written is strong due to the complexity of the character. His tactical genius and refusal to accept defeat is a constant throughout the film, with the film both beginning and ending with the latter. I've discussed the opening scene, but a similar event occurs at the end of the battle, when his Grand Army have fallen apart, and yet he refuses to accept defeat. To the point he talks about another time he seemingly lost a battle, but won it only a few hours later. This moment being somewhat ironic, as the victory he took of that battle has played out in a similar way to his defeat of this one, with one side winning before the other side came back right at the end. The entire film is based around this, as he returns to conquer Europe, and his refusal to give in is on full display, as despite signing his defeat in writing and being forced into exile, he returns less than a year later to pick up from where he left off. He isn't overconfident, but can come across like that in these moments, where despite the situation, he keeps trying to win. His dynamic with his marshals is interesting, as despite being their commander, there is a friendly bond present, this being most prominent with Le Bedouin, who is a young officer, which gives us a different dynamic with Napoleon. Then on the other hand, we have the more complex one with Ney, which is the most explored. This begins early on, as he is the most prominent of the marshals to encourage Napoleon to accept his enemy's terms. Then he is of course the leader of the force that failed to stop Napoleon and ended up joining him, before standing by him throughout the battle. The dynamic these two have feels complex and gives a sense of a history between them, with him trusting Ney considerably. He doesn't really get more notable dynamics with the rest of his marshals, or at least any of this level, with the rest being more of a group for him, although based on his small interactions with some of them, it's obvious they have a history. Any scene where Napoleon is having an inner monologue is a great one, as we really get an insight into his mind. These are most prominent right before the battle, but throughout the battle he has several moments where he's thinking about his opponent's tactics. It's a private view into his character at its truest, which isn't present through dialogue. These scenes are some of the best and rival the battle scenes for me. Now for the Duke of Wellington, played by Christopher Plummer. He's less explored than his opponent, but his initial scenes do a good job at setting up his character, mostly through his view of his redcoats. His scenes at the party are an early indication of his views about them, with him having complete confidence in the fact that they will follow him into battle on nothing but gin, showing a very low opinion of the people in his army despite their skill. There are plenty of these little moments, with another being the scene I mentioned earlier in which he confronts a soldier who has stolen a pig, and after listening to him fail to defend himself for breaking the law, gives him a promotion to corporal due to his sheer nerve. This is something which goes against the idea of a general of an army. Instead of reinforcing the rules with punishment, he instead rewards the soldier, something which obviously helps with morale. The build up to the battle is where we get a lot of his characterisation through his interactions with his colonels, notably during the planning stages. The first of this is him planning where the battle would take place, quickly gathering information on the position of the Grand Army, alongside the Prussians, and deciding the battleground that will give him the greatest advantage, Waterloo. His entire view of the battle is very interesting, as prior to the battle he keeps quite a level head, and presents himself as rather cool. This is most notable when he and his colonels are drinking prior to the battle beginning, alongside the earlier scene of when he is asked about his plans for the battle by his second in command, and he is just lying down with a newspaper over his head, and when he's actually asked the question he responds with,
"To beat the French."
These moments display his gentleman-like nature, if anything, that when even faced against the greatest foe in all of Europe, and potentially the world, he keeps his cool and acts like the gentleman he is. This image is something that is shaken as the battle proceeds though, with a sense of desperation being added to him, but once the Prussians arrive, this coolness returns in full force. A lot of his moments where he's making commands or plans during the battle are also great and perfectly reflect Napoleon's. His entire plan for the battle is to play for time, and so his strategy is to sit in one place and hold the hill while whittling down Napoleon's advancing forces. This allows for moments of him holding back his true strength and drawing his opponent into making moves while keeping his pieces in place. This is most pronounced on the occasions where either some of his colonels need support or there are chances for him to strike but he stands firm, with the latter being a case of Napoleon trying to make him move and see how he fights. A favourite scene of mine from this battle is when he draws Ney into an unsupported cavalry charge by having his army simply walk back 100 paces. A simple move which demonstrates his great knowledge of battle and his ability to understand his opponents, having taken Napoleon's disappearance from the battlefield as an opportunity to strike as opposed to his plan to sit and wait. I mentioned his scene at the end where he walks over the battlefield and shows his disdain of battle, and Plummer's performance is what gives this moment impact. And there are plenty of these small moments throughout where Plummer's performance is what gives more depth to the character. I will admit that I'm a bigger fan of Wellington than Napoleon, which is probably just the Brit inside me talking. Now we have the supporting cast to talk about, who won't be as in-depth, but there are a few of note. I think Napoleon's marshals are the less explored outside the two in particular, Ney and Le Bedouin. These two represent opposite ends of Napoleon's marshals, the older and more experienced against the younger and less experienced, and yet the way they act sometimes opposes this. The most notable moment of this is Ney's poorly planned cavalry charge. This is really Ney's defining moment, as despite his age he makes a move that plays a big part in Napoleon's loss. Now I am a bit more familiar with Ney than most others at the battle, and am aware that this moment is highly cut down from the real version, in which Ney's entire mental state during the battle seems somewhat self-harming, with several horses having died under him not dealing with the coalition's artillery during his charge, and at one point apparently hitting an enemy cannon with his sword. Despite that, we do get a good sense of him, a man whose loyalties seem a bit mixed. He was the one who led the other marshals in deposing Napoleon, then when his old emperor returned, despite what he said to King Louis, in which he over-exaggerated his orders.
But I promise your majesty I'll bring him back to Paris in an iron cage.
How they exaggerate. In an iron cage. Nobody asked for that.
He didn't capture Napoleon, instead joined him. He stood as his closest marshal and yet fell into an obvious trap that may have cost him the battle. I think Ney is a character who would have been more well-rounded in a longer film, but what we get shows a man in conflict. Now for Le Bedouin. I've mostly discussed his dynamic with Napoleon, which is what defines him, but there are smaller moments I haven't mentioned. We know that he has a son, and we would have liked to have brought him into the battle so he could have met Napoleon, this building into the larger than life view of Napoleon that he has. Something which really defines him is he stands by his side throughout the entire battle, including when Napoleon is forced to leave the battlefield due to his poor health catching up with him. His first moment of note is when Napoleon is declared an enemy of the coalition, and Le Bedouin uses this as a chance to stroke Napoleon's ego, and essentially sucks up to him by seeing it as an honour, with his opponents considering him equal to a nation. Really, Le Bedouin overall is someone who idolises Napoleon to the point that it becomes his character. Now for the English, who I think are well less defined than their French counterparts, but there are significantly more of them on the same level, rather than there being several but with a few who are more important. This causes two problems though. As well gives us more memorable characters on one side of the battle than the other, it means they are all quite flat characters within the film. We'll begin with Delancey, who serves a similar role to that of Le Bedouin. Through most of the battle he stands by Wellington's side, but doesn't idolise him in the same way that Le Bedouin does, instead seeing him as a commander and not a godlike figure. My only problem with Delancey is that I kept confusing him for Lord Hay, who was engaged, and as there's a line that sets up the fact that he's obviously going to die, and while he does, I didn't realise it was him who had died at that moment, and so thought Delancey's death was his. This is the real problem I mentioned before of there being so many characters which have limited screen time on one side, as these two blended together in my head, which led to an emotional death just being a death, while a more regular death was emotional. Picton on the other hand feels like he's used for comedy, as his first notable moment is him putting the unexperienced Lord Hay in his place concerning how dangerous the French are. Then during the battle he isn't really in the proper uniform and instead looks more like an undertaker who has stumbled into the battlefield, something Wellington somewhat slights him for. Then we have Gordon, who is the leader of the Scottish forces, and so is the most distinctive of the commanders, entirely because of the accent and mannerisms. Gordon is one of the very few who survives the battle, although his final notable scene is quite far back from the end, as it's during the March of the Old Guard, when he informs Wellington how limited the ammunition is, but ensures him that they are good men and will stand. His moments are few and far between, but he's distinctive during those moments. Uxbridge is one of the longer lasting, but still doesn't make it through unharmed. As soon as the Prussians arrive, he gets his leg shot off by a cannonball. This scene is one I don't really know how to think about, as the way it plays out feels quite comedic for a scene where a guy has just lost his leg. But I suppose it's more than likely shock on both his and Wellington's part. He was the second in command of the battle, and so is often of Wellington's side as to know what his intentions are, in case he ever needs to take over. There are plenty of other characters on both sides, but I can't discuss all of them, as most are quite simple, which is due to the nature of the plot. We have more of Napoleon's marshals and generals, all the female characters, and the few Prussian characters who don't get enough screen time to really make note of them outside their single scenes. The focus is on Napoleon and Wellington alongside the battle, meaning side characters are sacrificed for that. This allows for two strong main characters alongside a very detailed and well presented battle, but you have side characters who are less interesting, and more so known for their memorable lines if anything. So something I want to discuss at least briefly is the missing historical context of the film, as there are details which are skipped over due to the way the film starts. The film does its best to fill in some of this with the opening text, but can only do so much with this, and so some stuff is lost. I think the most important aspect of the missing historical context is why Napoleon was able to return to France and take over, as the film kind of skips over this to keep the pace up. So during the year that Napoleon was away, King Louis XVIII was given the throne of France, and immediately reminded the nation why they had a revolution a few decades ago. This led to the nation once again turning against the nobles, which allowed Napoleon to return and take power, as he was one of the men who brought peace to France before. I don't think this lack of information hurts the film overall, as the focus isn't exactly on the reasons he was able to take power again, just the fact that he was able to do so, and the scenes with the Old Guard and the later scenes when he returns with the soldiers and the grander populace demonstrate this presence perfectly. So while I wasn't really planning to talk about historical inaccuracies in any detail, I should at least mention a few of them, at least some of the more notable ones that I've heard in discussions about this film. First, the complaint I've seen is about the coalition, which is made up of armies of different nations, but the film focuses on the British, and makes it seem like the entire army was British redcoats, which was far from true. This lack of representation from the other nations is definitely more a standout thing, but I assume this decision was made for two reasons. One, for costuming and presentation, and two, for focusing the story, so not having to over-explain the army. A more minor thing next is I've heard that due to the quality of dye used for the redcoat uniforms back in the day, in reality their uniforms were somewhat run and turned pink. Whether this is entirely true or not, I don't know, but it's clear to understand why the filmmakers would have decided to keep the uniforms red rather than pink. Something which is more for the in-depth historian is the use of a song sung by the coalition soldiers prior to the battle. The song itself details the life of Napoleon, and so was made years after his death. The use of it here is to have a song that makes it sound to the layman that the soldiers are mocking their foe, and so the film arguably gets away with the use of it here, despite the historical inaccuracy, as it characterises the redcoats without having to dedicate screen time to them, plus characterises Wellington for his response to the singing, encouraging it as it wastes time, something he wouldn't do under other circumstances. I want to talk briefly about some of the actors, as this film features a lot of actors outside the 15,000 Soviet soldiers who were well known both on film and television for decades before and since. Admittedly, I know far more of the actors on the side of the coalition than the French, but I am well aware of the prestige of Rod Steiger. I do know that Gianni Garco, who played Duro, was in the incredibly popular episode of Space 1999, Dragon's Domain. Plus, I couldn't not mention Orson Welles' small role as King Louis XVIII. Citizen Kane himself was in this film, but clearly on the downward spiral of his career. Looking at the coalition, Wellington was of course played by the ever-great Christopher Plummer, an actor who has had many great roles across his life, but I know him best for his role as Kang in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. Pixon was played by Jack Hawkins, who at this point in his life was being dubbed as he could barely speak, with Robert Rietti dubbing him for this film, but had previously been in Bridge Over the River Kwai and Zulu. Delancey was played by Ian Ogilvy, who starred as Simon Templar in The Return of a Saint. Muffling was played by John Savidant, who was all over British television in the 1970s and 80s, but most relevantly had a small role in an episode of Sharp, also set during the Napoleonic Wars. Next we have Gordon, played by Rupert Davies, who famously played Inspector Maigret in the 1960s BBC adaptation of the Maigret books, a role I know him for so well that it's confusing to see him fighting the French. Then finally, since I can't not mention Doctor Who at any point, we have Uxbridge, who is played by Terence Alexander, who was in the Sixth Doctor story, The Mark of the Rani. The film certainly has quite the casts, and that's just from the few faces I know. We have many popular faces of television from this era or so, being led by two incredible film actors, who basically defined these two roles for decades to come, especially after a more recent film about one of these two leaders that will remain nameless. So that's Waterloo, an incredible film. The film features incredible cinematography, which gives the grand scale of this battle, and is what very few films I was able to do anything like this in the days before CGI, but still holds up far better than many of those films due to the realism of it. The plot is very simple, but strengthens its two leads, who are written and played incredibly well. The choice to spend more of half of the film focusing on just the characters allows them plenty of time to be well-rounded and feel real. This film both holds up script-wise and visually, with all of the elements coming together to form a masterpiece that was somewhat underappreciated in its time. Despite this film has gone on to inspire several other films with its depiction of the battle, notably The Lord of the Rings. At late, it's been getting a lot more love from more general audiences, with it being reassessed as a masterpiece of filmmaking with an unmatched scale that has never been seen before or since, and almost certainly will never be seen again.